everybody, it's Margaret here from Free Tours by Foot, and today we're going to be exploring the amazing and beautiful Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace is truly unique. Half of it is the original Tudor building, constructed in the early 1500s and then used as a home by King Henry VIII and a few of his wives. And 150 years after that, half of the palace was demolished during the reign of King William III and completely restructured in a totally new architectural style, which means you're kind of getting two palaces for the price of one. Since its construction in the early 16th century to the turn of the 18th century, Hampton Court Palace has been used as a primary royal home for numerous kings and queens, which means there's a lot of history inside, as well as a few royal secrets and scandals that need to be uncovered. So if you're ready, let's go. We begin by exploring the one-of-a-kind Tutor Kitchens, followed by the beautiful courtyard and incredible Great Hall. Then, we'll discover what remains of Henry VIII's apartments, before traveling through time to the 17th century to see the rooms built during the reign of Queen Mary II and King William III. Next, we'll follow the story of the Georgians, getting an inside glimpse of the Hanovarian court and the family dynamics that played out here at the palace. Lastly, we'll stroll through the stunning and iconic Hampton Court gardens, before finishing our tour with a last glance at one of the 16th century's most interesting creations. This is the incredible Hampton Court Palace. Situated on the edge of the River Thames to the southwest of central London, Hampton Court was originally designed, owned, and inhabited not by a king, but by Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York and Chief Minister to King Henry VIII. Wolsey began construction here in 1514. However, after failing to secure Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Wolsey handed the palace over to the king in 1528 in an effort to save himself from Henry's wrath. It didn't work. However, Henry gladly received his gift and embarked on a huge project of rebuilding and expansion, turning Hampton Court Palace into one of his most favored residences. The stunning entrance to the palace features the King's Beasts, 10 statues of heraldic animals that represent the ancestry of Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. Here's the King's crowned lion. And then next to that is the Seymour panther. You can see all the detail there. And then we'll come around to see my favorite, the Seymour unicorn, holding the arms of Queen Jane. Here we go. Beautiful. And then just next to that unicorn is the royal dragon, holding the Tudor coat of arms. There he is. We'll enter the palace through the original Tudor gatehouse, adorned with Henry VIII's coat of arms, supported by the Lion of England on the left and the Tudor dragon on the right. And we enter the palace through what is known as the Great Gatehouse. You can see some Halloween decorations there. Maybe we'll see a few ghosts on our journey today. But first, let's look up. Now look at this beautiful fan-vaulted ceiling made of Bath stone, decorated with various royal symbols. In the center, a shield featuring Queen Victoria's royal arms. You may also spot the VR symbol representing Queen Victoria, clues as to when this ceiling was redesigned in the 19th century. We also have the red and white Tudor rose, red cardinal hats, gold mitres, and white pallium, all three nods to Cardinal Wolsey, whose TC initials are also depicted here, as well as the Tudor crown. Stunning design. And now we enter the palace grounds. This is Base Court, the arrivals hall of Henry VIII's palace. It's here that visitors, courtiers, their servants, and all their luggage would enter Hampton Court. The more important a guest, the further into the palace they were permitted to go, so a large proportion of people stayed right here. And we'll return to learn a bit more about Base Court and the people who stayed here in a bit. But first, I want to show you something truly unique. Here at Hampton Court Palace, we have the largest surviving Renaissance kitchens in all of Europe. These kitchens were originally built to feed around 450 people, But Henry needed more. Henry VIII could be accompanied at any time by around 800 courtiers, and they all needed to be fed. In 1529, the kitchens here were quadrupled in size, rebuilt and equipped to serve 1,600 meals per day. In fact, the kitchens here during the reign of Henry VIII were so large, they employed 200 staff and took up to 1/3 of the entire palace complex. We first enter Master Carpenter's Court. This is where all the provisions for the court would have entered the kitchen complex, before being taken to storage or directly to one of the kitchens themselves. The higher ranking a person was, the better their food and drink, so there was a wide variety of both coming through this courtyard. To sort it all out, there were 19 different departments, all organized and overseen by a group of officials known as the Board of the Green Cloth, as well as John Dale, master cook for the king's household. Today the courtyard is set up to look as though there's recently been a delivery made, and we can see some of the goods that have been brought in before us with their Tudor spelling. Now we enter the kitchens, firstly into the boiling house. This area was used for food preparation, such as preparing pies to be baked, or part cooking joints of meat. As we come around the corner, we see a member of kitchen staff depicted, as well as kitchen goods, such as equipment, dried herbs, and meat. And just down here we have a list of a small amount of the meat that would have been served at Henry's palace. Beef, veal, mutton, deer, pheasant, and chicken. And like I said, this is just a small sample of the variety that could be found at Henry's palace. Over here we see more pies, ready for baking, and then we'll see a small staircase that would have led up to a giant pot of boiling water, where meat was constantly being boiled before being roasted over a spit later, hence the name of this kitchen, the boiling house. Here's where the fire would have burned to keep that water boiling. And now we're going to leave the boiling house, passing more pies and a fire extinguisher, which is definitely not original to the 16th century, and we come out into Fish Court. No prizes for guessing what was kept in this part of the kitchens. As we come down this alleyway, we're actually walking down a Tudor refrigerator. This narrow courtyard runs north to south, which means the sun never shines in, and the space is open to the air year-round, keeping the stones and bricks nice and cool, perfect for storing fish. Behind each of these green doors you would have found barrels packed with seaweed, containing all sorts of sea fish like plaice, turbot, halibut, and even porpoises. Freshwater fish would have been kept live in the fish ponds within the gardens. Now we enter the Great Kitchen. From 1530 until 1737, the Great Kitchen was a central part of life at court, and not only just for feeding the hundreds of people who were here. Throughout the centuries, food served at court was a direct display of the monarch's power. A large menu, full of variety, featuring foods which were considered exotic from faraway countries, were a display of the monarch's wealth. Henry's guests could expect not only fresh meat and fish, but almonds, olive oil, and citrus fruits from the Mediterranean, dishes sweetened with sugar from the Middle East, meals made with spices from Africa, India, and even as far away as China. These images depict some of the staff, including children, who would have worked here. And as we come around, we'll see a charcoal stove, which was a later addition to the kitchen, there we go, replacing a roasting spit that would have been here in Henry's time. In fact, there were 6 huge fires in these kitchens, all set up with spits to roast meat, which in itself was impressive. For most people in Tudor times, cured, salted, or smoked meat would have been all they had access to. But at Henry's court, the meat was always fresh and served every day, an incredible luxury at the time. Up here you can see the gigantic wood ceiling hanging over us, which would have had great holes in it for all the steam and smoke to escape, which, in reality, did little to help the harsh conditions inside the kitchen. It was so hot the joints of meat were partially basted with the sweat of the workers turning the spits. Yum. A Spanish visitor to court in 1554 recorded that the kitchens were, quote, veritable hells. In fact, Henry had to issue a specific order to the kitchen staff, instructing them that they had to wear clothes while working, as so many of them chose to go about their business naked, which seems quite of a risky move to me, especially given that many cooks were retired and pensioned off after being badly burned at work. Here we see a number of cauldrons, which would have been in near constant use. Next to the fire ahead, a pile of wood, just some of the 1.3 million logs that would have been burnt throughout the year in the kitchens. Here, some of those spices I mentioned earlier, again, with that interesting Tudor spelling, cinnamon with an SY there. Now what's over here? A sign that says, "Do not eat, for the king's mouth only." These bags would have eventually been taken to a smaller, private kitchen, which is where Henry's food was prepared by his master cook, John Bricket. The notes on the tablecloth here tell us that these herbs, all of which are real, were grown in the palace gardens. And through here, we see one of those Tudor fires actually in use. You can see the ironwork for all the spits that would have been here, and imagine how hot it would have been to turn them for hours and hours. You can see the soot here, left behind from centuries of smoke climbing up the wall. The kitchens are busy today, as they would have been in centuries gone past. The amount of food that came through here was astounding. In 1 year, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the kitchen staff prepared 53 wild boar, 760 calves, 1,240 oxen, 1,870 pigs, 2,330 deer, and 8,200 sheep, as well as the thousands of birds, seafood, and non-meat dishes that would have been served. And in this area, the plating. All the items you see here are valuable pewter, and this is where all the food was placed to be taken to the Great Hall and other chambers. It was taken through the big hatches that you can see there on the left. Now, on the other side of those hatches, in what's called serving place, we have the office where the kitchen clerks would have worked, checking things over before dishes were officially served, and where all the pewter was returned and counted to make sure everything actually came back again. And from serving place, we're following the route that some of the food would have taken. Dishes that were to be sent to the Great Hall would come this way, through a little room up here on the right. Here we go. This is also where table settings and linens were kept and taken up before the meals. These back stairways ensured that guests wouldn't have to see the staff working behind the scenes. Here we can see a napkin being pressed in a wooden device on the table. And now to one of my favorite rooms in the palace, which will tell you a lot about how I spend my free time. The wine cellar. There were a few cellars here during Henry's time, storing not just wine but also beer and ale. It may surprise you to hear that Hampton Court also had running fresh water, safe to drink, that was piped in from a spring over 2 miles away. Here we see the vaulted stone ceiling, keeping all the wine nice and cool. In the 16th century, wine was a status symbol. Much of it shipped in from Europe and at great expense, so of course that is what Henry liked to serve and drink himself. Claret and Bordeaux were the most popular at Henry's court. Sweet wines from Greece and Cyprus were popular for after dinner. When ready, the wine was placed into jugs in this room, which were then carried throughout the rest of the palace. Now, when we come over here, I'm going to share a little ghost story with you. Hampton Court is said to be haunted by numerous spirits, one of whom supposedly resides in this cellar, the Sandman. And if this isn't your sort of thing, feel free to skip the next 30 seconds. It is said that through the years, palace guards would hear thumps and banging coming from the wine cellar during the night, but whenever they would go to investigate, the noises would stop and the cellar would be empty. Palace staff reported seeing shadows on the walls, the outline of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, but when they'd turn around, nobody would be there. Is the Sandman still lurking in the lower cellar to this day? Some people say yes. The barrels that we see today represent only a fraction of what would have been consumed at Hampton Court during the reign of Henry VIII. It's estimated that, on average, Henry's court would consume 75,000 gallons of wine and 600,000 gallons of ale, the beverage served to his staff, costing an estimated £6 million every single year. And out of the cellars now, along this long corridor which will take us back out onto Base Court, opposite the side from which we entered the palace complex. You may notice a gentleman ahead of me wearing green, dressed in the style of the 16th century. A visitor from Henry's court, perhaps? Now, you might remember that I described Base Court as an arrivals area, and also where many people stayed while visiting the palace. Servants and those lower down on the social ladder would literally camp in Base Court. Those higher up, however, would stay in the rooms that surrounded it. Behind many of the windows you see are dozens and dozens of courtiers' lodgings, which were said to be some of the finest in the country. Furnished with silver candlesticks and a pot of wine, each room also had its own fireplace and its own garderobe, or toilet. That may not sound very exciting to us, but lower ranks of courtiers were expected to use the Great House of Easement, a 2-story communal toilet block hanging over the moat that could seat up to 14 people at a time. Up ahead of us, you can see a red and white structure, a fully working recreation of a 16th century wine fountain. In 2008, archaeologists working in Base Court uncovered the foundations of an octagonal fountain that previously stood here. It's not known if that fountain flowed with water or wine, but fountains filling with wine were an incredibly popular sight at Tudor celebrations. In addition to having wine fountains at court, they would be erected throughout London in times of royal celebration, weddings or coronations, for example, and public water fountains would occasionally flow with wine for the same reasons. Anybody could simply grab a glass, walk on down, and have a good old time. The one at Hampton Court is as faithful a recreation as can be, given no original wine fountains still exist. Architects based this one on the fountain depicted in a painting showing the Field of the Cloth of Gold, which was a summit meeting between Kings Henry VIII and King Francis I of France in 1520. The painting depicts the two kings meeting, and even wrestling each other, as well as hundreds of courtiers, some of whom are gathered around a fountain, enjoying the freely flowing wine. This version, although smaller than the one used during the Field of the Cloth of Gold, is built using authentic materials, timber, lead bronze, and gold leaf. The inner workings, however, are straight from the 21st century and are equipped to serve both red and white wine, just as Henry's would have done. And now we're going to head back into the palace, to Henry VIII's apartments. To get there, we're going to enter through another gatehouse up ahead, now known as Anne Boleyn's gatehouse, where her apartments once stood. While we're walking, I want to mention two architectural features that are of note. Firstly, most of the palace is constructed in red brick, an incredibly expensive material, highly fashionable in the upper classes, and a real display of wealth at the time. Secondly, on top of the palace, 241 decorated chimneys, another status symbol, a sign of the number of fireplaces the king could afford to keep burning for his guests. Now, we'll get to Henry VIII's tumultuous matrimonial life in a moment, but for now, let's refer to 1536. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, has recently been executed, at her husband's command, and Henry is married again to Jane Seymour. The king has ordered that Anne's apartments at Hampton Court should be refurbished for his new queen, and all reminders of his previous wife be erased from the building. Sounds a simple enough task, but somebody, somewhere along the line, seems to have forgotten something, right up here. As we look straight up, you can see the large Tudor rose right in the middle of the ceiling, but on either side of it, the upper right and lower left, are two emblems, circled in red, containing the initials A and H for Anne and Henry, encircled by what's known as a lover's knot. Another one of these can also be found carved in wood in the Great Hall. A closer look also reveals two falcons, circled in blue. Anne Boleyn's principal badge was a white falcon, wearing a crown and holding a scepter in one claw. The falcon was said to represent an ambitious person who would never rest until their task was complete. The ones in the gatehouse today are Victorian replacements, but here is an image of one of the original falcons that once adorned the gatehouse ceiling, a lasting reminder of the second wife that Henry tried so hard to erase from his past. And now we climb the stairs toward the magnificent Great Hall. As we climb the stairs here, if you look ahead, you'll see a crisscross or diamond pattern on the brickwork in front of us. This pattern is repeated all over the palace and was made using overfired bricks strategically placed amongst the regular red ones. This was considered quite fashionable in the 16th century. Now as we come to this doorway, you can see Henry's coat of arms here in the corner. There's an incredible level of detail around all of Henry's doorways throughout the palace, and I'll show you another example as we go. Here we can see the other side. Now we're going to be entering firstly into a smaller chamber adjacent to the hall where staff would have scurried to and fro, bringing goods up from the kitchen through a door hidden behind the green cloth ahead of us. To the right, a glimpse of the hall through the cloth, and over to our left, a portrait of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, framed by her motto, "Humble and Loyal." And below it, an example of a Hampton Court Palace doorway decoration dating from the time of Henry's marriage to Catherine. On the left, you can see her coat of arms, and trailing along the right are a number of pomegranates, which was Catherine's emblem, representing Christ's resurrection, and was also a symbol of fertility. And over here, opposite Catherine, is Anne's portrait, and her motto, "The Most Happy," which I'm sure seemed like a good choice at the time. Both her motto and Catherine's fertility symbol seem a little bit cruel in retrospect, but this isn't a Wives of Henry VIII video, so I will move along, but do let me know if you'd be interested in that. As we turn around here, we will finally be stepping into the Great Hall. This beautiful building was the primary hub of court activity during Henry's reign, and was by far the largest room in the palace, and one of the largest in the country, towering to 18 meters or 60 feet high. Built between 1532 and 1535, Henry's masons, carpenters, bricklayers, and laborers sometimes worked nearly 24 hours a day, constructing by candlelight when necessary to complete it. Once it was completed, this hall was used every single day, and not only by the royal family. When the king wasn't throwing elaborate feasts and parties, the Great Hall acted as a staff canteen and seated up to 450 people twice a day, at 10 a.m. and again at 4 p.m. exactly. Up above us sits this beautiful hammer beam roof, the work of the king's master carpenter, James Needham. And in Henry's time, it would have been painted in shades of blue, gold, and red. Love it. This is a view of the small chamber we entered into, behind those wood screens, and above, a ledge, overlooked by beautiful stained glass, where musicians could play during banquets. You can see Henry in the middle of the glass, and it's a little disappointing to have to tell you that the glass dates from the 19th century. None of the original Tudor stained glass in the hall survived. Come around. In the center of the hall is a rarely used hearth. Then we see the high table where the king and queen would have presided, more beautiful Victorian stained glass, and another look up to this fabulous roof where I can just about see we are being watched. High in the rafters lurk the eavesdroppers, intricately carved busts of men and women constantly looking down at the goings-on in the hall, a reminder to everybody that just because the king is not present doesn't mean nobody's watching you. Now, can you imagine this hall during one of the king's banquets? Packed with hundreds of people on long benches, the flickering light of hundreds of candles, the music playing, the smells of course after course of delicious food, piles of shining gold plate, the singing and the laughter, the clack of footsteps on the sumptuous green and white floor tiles, all completely surrounded by these hanging tapestries whose gold threads would have glittered in the candlelight. Henry VIII loved tapestries. In fact, by the time of his death, he owned over 2,000 of them, believed to be the largest collection in history, especially impressive given that even Henry's richest courtiers would only own between 50 to 100. Today, only 30 of them are left, many of which are hanging here in the Great Hall, richly woven in silk and gold. These works of art are another way for Henry to display his wealth, a portable means of showcasing his status. These luxurious hangings could be rolled up and transported to any destination, constantly surrounding the king and his guests with splendor. Many of the tapestries, most of which came from Brussels, depicted biblical stories or heroic legends, so visitors would associate these great tales with Henry himself. Others would depict virtues or vices, encouraging good behavior among the court. A set of tapestries to adorn a standard-sized room could take a team of men around 2 years to make, so this collection represents decades of man-hours and untold sums of money. And now we come to the high table. Today the table is set with pewter, but of course the king himself ate off gold plate. He would also be the only person provided with a fork. Everybody else was given a spoon and were expected to bring their own knives. Henry's feasts and banquets were always over the top, with constant entertainment, dozens and dozens of dishes served, plentiful drink, courtly displays like live music or plays, which Henry himself would occasionally take part in. In fact, in his early years, he was known as an excellent dancer. Everything was meant to impress, and his entertainment efforts did not go unnoticed. Letters from foreign ambassadors who were guests of his detail the food, music, and spectacles enjoyed at Henry's court. Notice the peacock in this next painting. It was quite common for Henry's guests to be served roasted peacock or swan, whose feathers would be carefully placed back after cooking to create impressive centerpieces. In addition to the dozens of dishes to choose from, guests could expect treats like edible sculptures, a Tudor favorite. Known as subtleties, they would be made from sweetmeats, marzipan, and gold leaf, or truly luxurious, chocolate. In fact, there was a chocolate chess set served at one of Henry's banquets, and guests were encouraged to play a game before eating it. It was also noted that Henry was a keen musician, who was known to entertain his guests at dinners by playing every instrument he owned as a bit of a party trick. In addition to music and masks, fools or minstrels, such as one of Henry's favorites, Will Sommers, would often stroll through the hall during feasts, casually insulting courtiers as they went, asking somebody, quote, "Sir, what say ye with your fat face?" was a favorite of one of Henry's fools, the only person at court who would dare speak to the king that way. It's worth mentioning that court entertainment and feasts in the Great Hall didn't die with Henry VIII. The Stuarts also utilized the space for courtly theatrics. Shakespeare himself appeared before King James I here, while Inigo Jones and Ben Jonson designed extravagant court masks. Parties during the 17th century were so hedonistic that their court was described as, quote, "a nursery of lust and impertinence." Strategically adjacent to the high table is this huge bay window. This would have been the brightest area in the hall, the light coming in directly toward the raised dais where the high table sat, ensuring Henry was always the center of attention. It's believed this window was originally part of Wolsey's Hall, and Henry opted to keep it as part of his new building. The beautiful glass, amended in the 19th century and restored again in 2008, depicts coat of arms, such as these of Cardinal Wolsey's, showing titles, badges, and symbols. Get a good close look here. His titles are listed at the bottom of the windows as well. A final look around the hall. Note that while the Great Hall was open to most of the court on a daily basis, the further into the palace we go, the fewer people were allowed. The next room, for example, was only accessible to lords, knights, gentlemen officers of the king's house, and other honest persons. Servants, rascals, and boys were not to enter unless absolutely necessary. More doorway detailing there. This is the Great Watching Chamber. It gets its name from the fact that this is where Henry's yeoman guards would have been stationed, on constant watch and controlling access to Henry's private apartments, the entrance to which lies on the other side of the room. Up ahead here we have more stained glass windows. Henry's coat of arms makes another appearance, and he is actually here himself. There we go. And he's right underneath a depiction of Cardinal Wolsey. I don't know how either of them would feel about that. Again, we see the tapestries on display here, part of Wolsey's original collection. And as we come down, there's a marble fireplace, which is a later addition. If we focus in on the shield in the middle of the fireplace, we'll see the design features a C and an R, Charles Rex, King Charles, dating from the 1620s at the earliest. And above, a watercolor version of a mural that once existed in Henry VIII's palace in Whitehall. Painted by Hans Holbein the Younger in 1537, the painting is intended to reiterate Henry's right to hold the throne through his family dynasty. Behind him stands his father, King Henry VII, and opposite him is Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. Their union brought together the warring houses of Lancaster and York, highlighting Henry's bloodline through both families. Opposite Henry stands Jane Seymour, mother of his only surviving son, and continuation of the great Tudor bloodline, Edward VI. Take note that aside from the tapestries and the ceiling, everything else in this room dates from the late 1600s, when King William III carried out heavy reconstruction to the palace, demolishing the majority of Henry's private apartments, which we'll talk more about shortly. In Henry's time, this room was decorated to celebrate Henry's third queen, Jane Seymour. She and Henry were married in 1536, and in September of 1537, Jane and Henry came here in preparation for the birth of their child. On the 12th of October, at around 2 in the morning, Jane gave birth to Henry's longed-for male heir, Edward. Shortly after his birth, Edward was processed through the palace and was carried through this room on display to the eagerly awaiting courtiers who'd congregated here and in the Great Hall, hoping to get a good view. However, tragedy would soon strike. Jane never recovered from her difficult labor and delivery, and would die on the 24th of October here at Hampton Court Palace. Unknown to all at the time was that Edward himself would have his life cut short, dying at the age of just 15. But before that sadness was pure joy, and Henry ordered this ceiling decorated with not only his own emblems, but that of his wife as well. Jane's badge was that of a phoenix rising from a castle, a symbol of birth and renewal, the new queen, ready to be all that the king desired. Her chosen motto was, quote, "bound to obey and serve." The badges and decoration on the ceiling area are a mix of restored originals, as well as some 19th century copies. But as you see it now is exactly how it would have been in the time of Henry VIII. Henry's palace would have been rich with color in every room. Would you want a roof like that in your house? Let me know what you think. As we leave the Great Watching Chamber, we now go to the Processional Chamber, and immediately on our right is the Pages' Room. Pages of the chamber spent most of their days serving courtiers in the adjoining Great Watching Chamber. Pages were to awake at 7 a.m. and began their days by making fires for the rest of the palace. This was their office, as well as their bedroom. and, as you can see here, where they would have dined as well. They had to remain here all day because they would constantly be on call. Just a close-up. Doesn't look like they're getting too much to eat. As we exit, straight ahead of us is a portrait of Anne of Cleves, as well as her motto, quote, "God send me well to keep." Anne was Henry's fourth wife, chosen as his bride based primarily on this portrait by Hans Holbein. Despite the fact that commentators at the time described the portrait as a true likeness, Henry disagreed and was unhappy with her appearance when he first saw her, announcing to his courtiers, quote, "I like her not." Their marriage would last only 6 months, not long enough for her to make an impression in the king's court. Her badge, the ducal badge of Cleves, depicts an 8-spangled wheel with no rim, and it appears nowhere in Henry's apartments. Next in the processional chamber, we come across an enigmatic painting, a portrait of an unknown man in red, painted by an unknown artist. His clothing as well as technical analysis tells us that this portrait was created between 1530 and 1550. It was purchased by King Charles II, who was told it was a portrait of a young Henry VIII, although this seems unlikely. Other candidates are Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, which I can kind of see, or Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Henry VIII's illegitimate son. What do you guys think? And next, a commanding portrait of the king himself. Portraits like these were meant to convey Henry's physical presence, particularly to people who had never met him in person. It is unlikely that the portrait was hung here originally, as the processional chamber was one of the few locations in the palace where visitors would get a chance to glimpse the king. Dressed in his crown and finest robes, Henry would emerge from his private apartments and process through this corridor on Sundays and religious festivals, as this was the path from his private apartments to the chapel. Courtiers would line the route, everybody eagerly awaiting an opportunity to see the king, and for the king to see them. Reportedly, it was during one of these processions that Henry first set eyes upon his next wife, Catherine Howard. And now we enter the next part of Henry's processional route, the haunted gallery. As we enter, there's a portrait on the left depicting Catherine Howard, as well as her motto, quote, "No other will than his." Catherine and Henry were married just 19 days after the annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Catherine's age isn't known, but she was likely around 19, while the king was 49. Henry was besotted with her, spoiling her with gifts at their first Christmas together, spent here at Hampton Court, and calling her his, quote, "rose without a thorn," leading to the creation of her badge depicting a thornless Tudor rose. Within 2 years of their marriage, however, Catherine was accused of adultery, and Henry was furious. Reportedly, his counselors thought he had gone mad, such was the extent of his rage. Henry was in the nearby chapel when Catherine learned she was to be charged with adultery, a crime for which her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had been executed. Hysterical, she escaped her guards and ran screaming down the processional route, trying to get to the king. She believed if she could get to him, she could convince him of her innocence. However, she never made it. She was seized by guards and taken, screaming and wailing, back to her apartments. She would never see Henry again, and was executed at the Tower of London on the 13th of February, 1542. Reportedly, Catherine's spirit is not at rest. For centuries, stories have circulated that Catherine's ghost can be seen rushing down the gallery, and the echoes of her screams are heard in this part of the palace. So embedded in palace lore is this story that by the time Hampton Court was open to the public in the 19th century, this room was already referred to as the Haunted Gallery. The Victorians loved ghost stories and really tried to capitalize on the idea of Hampton Court Palace being haunted, as you can see from these historical postcards, property of HRP, featuring the quote-unquote ghosts of the palace. Catherine Howard is there, of course. In fact, she appears twice. Here, and then again in the Great Hall, with, confusingly, what appears to be her executioner. How did he get here? There she is. Another shows us Sybil Penn, known at the palace as the Grey Lady. A wet nurse to Edward VI, she later nursed Queen Elizabeth I devotedly during a bout of smallpox. The Queen would survive, but Sybil didn't. Her restless spirit is still said to walk these halls. Although these days, perhaps the most famous ghost is that of the affectionately named Skelator. For 3 consecutive nights in 2003, Hampton Court security staff were notified of the opening of a fire door near Clock Court. CCTV footage from all 3 nights clearly shows the doors forcefully being flung open, but on the second night, the footage reveals a figure. Dressed in period clothing, the unknown entity reaches out after the doors have been forced open and closes them one by one. If a prank, no one has ever come forward to claim credit, and the true origins of Skelator remain a mystery. Now, back to the haunted gallery, and immediately over to this huge painting here. At the top of the painting is St. George attacking the dragon, and below him 2 tents, whose flaps are being held open by an angel, revealing Henry VII, his wife Elizabeth of York, and all of their children, sons behind Henry and daughters behind Elizabeth. The reality behind the figures isn't a happy one. Of the princes, only Henry was alive when this painting was created in the early 1500s. Of the women, only 2 princesses were alive, Mary and Margaret. Elizabeth herself died shortly after giving birth to her last daughter, who also did not survive, Catherine. Now just through here we can see a small antechamber en route to the chapel. Still in active use today, the chapel was built by Thomas Wolsey, but it was Henry VIII who installed the magnificent vaulting in the 1530s and Queen Anne who refurbished the rest of the interior in the early 1700s. There was once a great stained glass double window featuring images of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, but this was sadly destroyed during the Commonwealth. Note, however, that during worship, the royal family would not have sat with everybody else. The door in the haunted gallery leads to a small first-floor room, like a box at the opera, overlooking the chapel. This is reserved for the monarch, and smaller boxes on either side are for the gentlemen and ladies of the court. The next painting along this corridor is another family portrait, again showcasing Henry's dynastic importance. Although the artist is unknown, the painting is believed to date from around 1545, when the king finally acknowledged his daughters as heirs to the throne. This portrait of an idealized family features Jane on the left, a fool who lived in Princess Mary's household, followed by Mary, future Queen Mary I, aged about 29. Next come Henry's beloved heir, 8-year-old Edward, standing right next to the king himself, who is also flanked by Jane Seymour, the highly regarded deceased mother of his son. Further down is the future Queen Elizabeth I, here as a 12-year-old princess, and in the doorway behind her, Will Somers, Henry's fool. Past the chapel exit, we then come to a set of 3 paintings. The largest is that of King Edward VI. A child king always leads to an unsettled power dynamic as various courtiers fight to control the monarch. The purpose of this portrait is to show us that the young king is just as strong, as powerful, and as capable as his father was. The fact that Edward is standing in exactly the same position his father was so frequently depicted in is no coincidence. And to the right, 2 smaller portraits, firstly Anne Boleyn, and below her, her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, in a painting dating from the 1580s by an unknown artist. And then, just ahead of us, on an easel you can see on the left, a portrait of Henry VIII's 6th wife, Catherine Parr, displaying her motto, quote, "To be useful in all that I do." Catherine and Henry were married on the 12th of July in 1543 at the Chapel Royal here at Hampton Court Palace. Although their marriage was a relatively smooth one, Catherine's badge, depicting St. Catherine and a Tudor rose, was never incorporated into the palace design. Catherine and Henry would remain married until Henry's death in 1548, and adjacent to Catherine's portrait is the couple's wedding certificate. Amongst all the words here is a record of Catherine's words at the wedding, beginning with, as is still common today, the words, quote, "With this ring, I, be wed. And now we say goodbye to the Haunted Gallery and goodbye to Henry VIII and the 16th century. A final look. On we go. Although Hampton Court was Henry's luxurious and fashionable grand palace, by the 1680s it was considered woefully out of date, particularly in comparison with new centers of European entertainment such as the Palace of Versailles, which you're looking at here. In 1689, joint monarchs William III and Mary II set out to completely rebuild Hampton Court, intending to demolish the Tudor palace piece by piece, starting with Henry VIII's staterooms and apartments, preserving only the Great Hall, replacing it all with a new Baroque building. This plan never reached complete fruition, but from here on, we will be walking through the rooms William and Mary, and Architect Royal Christopher Wren, along with his Clerk of Works Nicholas Hawksmoor, created. We start with the Queen's Staircase. Although the staircase with its wrought iron balustrade dates from the time of William and Mary, it was Queen Caroline, wife of King George II, who, in 1734, ordered the painting of the walls and ceiling, which had originally been left plain. Caroline called in her favorite architect, William Kent, to create the visuals you see on the walls today. Kent's design is a Roman-style tribute to Caroline, whom he compares to the ancient goddess Britannia. The huge painting opposite is by Gerrit von Hathorst and is titled "The Liberal Arts Are Presented to Charles I." In the middle of the painting is the king's controversial favorite, the Duke of Buckingham, dressed as Mercury, leading figures representing the arts and sciences. In the cloud sits King Charles I and his wife, Henrietta Maria, as Apollo and Diana, emphasizing Charles's position as a powerful monarch and patron of the arts. Another look at that lovely wrought iron, created by master smith Jean Tigeot. And as we look to the ceiling, we see the cross of St. George surrounded by a garter. The arms are the most noble order of the garter, which still exists today. Straight in the center is the chain that holds the chandelier, which was being cleaned during our visit. And now we'll enter the Queen's Guard Chamber, built on the site of Anne Boleyn's apartments. This was the first room in the suite of the Queen's apartments, and where the yeomen of the guard would have kept watch and controlled access to the Queen's rooms. The higher a person's status, the further into the apartments they were permitted to go. This room is large, well lit, and open. The closer to the king or queen a visitor would get to, the smaller and more intimate the rooms would become. An interesting feature of this room, believed to have been added during the reign of King George I, so 1714 to 27, depicts two somewhat comical and I think a little creepy yeomen of the guard framing the fireplace. Here's the other one. Let me know what you guys think of this in the comments. I don't know. Note that although these rooms were laid out for William and Mary, they were sadly not to be enjoyed for long. Queen Mary II died in 1694, 5 years after her and William's rebuilding began. William, distraught, ceased work, only resuming in 1699, but he too would die just 3 years later in 1702. Mary's sister Anne took control of the palace and did some decorating, including refurbishing the chapel we discussed earlier. But it was after Anne's death, when the Hanovarians came to the throne, that Hampton Court truly began to thrive, resuming its role as a fashionable entertainment venue. King George I, a distant Stuart cousin, inherited the throne in 1714. Not something he was pleased about, having wished to remain in his beloved Germany. Seen as a dull and cold individual, George was never popular with his subjects. He also had no queen, considered a crucial part of court, having divorced, then imprisoned his wife, seen here, when she was accused of having an affair, forbidding her to ever see her children again. his court was not one of fun or fashion. However, when George would return to Hanover for the summers, his son, George, Prince of Wales, seen here, and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, who you'll see next, would take control of the court, and they did it in style. The Prince of Wales disliked his father. You would too if your dad locked your mom away for 30 years until her death, and was determined to outdo him and win the favor of the court. The young couple would entertain in lavish style here at the palace, and most of the decor that we see from here on is the result of the future King George II and his Queen Caroline. Originally, this room would have been furbished, of course. Provided you were dressed nicely enough, anybody could enter the 18th century palace, which means the guards stationed here were literally protecting the gateway to the court and had complete power to throw out any undesirables who tried to enter. Luckily today, we passed the test. Through this window here, we have a brief view of Hampton Court, around which this half of the palace was built. It's currently partially under construction, hence the wooden board around the center. The view opposite us is repeated on all four sides of the courtyard. Now we enter what's called the presence chamber. When Prince George and Princess Caroline were living at Hampton Court, there would have been 2 chairs under a canopy where they would sit to receive visitors. Today the room is decorated with a series of portraits and paintings, all related to the Hanovarians. As we pan around, you can see the beautiful wooden paneling, more windows, and then I really like the huge decorative doorknobs and locks. Look at that. The first portrait we see in here is that of King George I, the first Hanovarian ruler who we talked about earlier. George, Elector of Hanover, was not raised expecting to inherit the British throne. After the Act of Settlement in 1701, Roman Catholics, or anybody who married a Roman Catholic, were barred from taking the crown. George was the heirless Queen Anne's nearest Protestant relative, directly descended from King James I, and it was he who inherited the throne after Queen Anne's death in 1714. This next painting takes us back in time, depicting Princess Elizabeth, James I's daughter, and her new husband, Frederick, Elector Palatine, leaving England for Bohemia, where they would rule as queen and king. King George I was their grandson. Next, another beautiful marble fireplace. There are quite a few here. Very grand. And then a portrait of Princess Caroline. When her father-in-law, George I, inherited the throne in 1714, she was already married to his son, future King George II. The couple came to England the same time as the new king, along with their 2 daughters, but leaving behind their son, Frederick, in Hanover, to be raised by private tutors. And over here, Caroline's husband, George, Prince of Wales. George was described as having, quote, loved his mother as much as he hated his father. Upon arrival in England, George courted popularity with the public, claiming that he had no drop of blood that was not English. His embracing of his new country and their language, the opposite of his father's behavior, made him popular, much to the new king's annoyance. After an argument during the christening of George and Caroline's second son, George William, the Prince of Wales and his wife began to create a rival court, actively opposing the king. You see the ceilings here are relatively simplistic, but still beautiful. As we leave the presence chamber, we'll take a quick detour down a hall to the left. This will take us to what was previously the apartments of the Prince and Princesses of Wales's daughters. Sadly, George and Caroline's children became pawns in their conflict with King George. After the argument at the christening, the Prince and Princess were confined to their apartments before being banished from court. However, the king kept their children, occasionally in the rooms in this area of the palace, not permitting George and Caroline to see them. The prince and princess were devastated, once even sneaking into the palace to see their children, whereupon Caroline fainted and George broke down in tears. The king would eventually allow them to see their son and daughters once a week, little consolation to the couple, especially as their youngest son, George William, would die within a matter of weeks. Now into the public dining room. Not a room where the public would dine, but rather a room where the king would dine and the public would watch. This tradition had been carried out for centuries, and King George I was not inclined to continue it. However, the Prince and Princess of Wales did it, much to the appreciation of the court, so George was compelled to continue the tradition. The idea behind this strange ritual is that it displays the king's magnificence and good health, as well as showing off the food and drink that was accessible at court. George particularly enjoyed French dishes, as well as German dishes he missed from home, and all of it was served on gold and silver plate. On special occasions, the table would be decorated with starched and intricately folded linens, manipulated into the shape of vegetables, animals, and mythical creatures. Napkin folding was an art particularly popular in the royal courts of Germany, and George brought it with him here to Hampton Court Palace. You see there's a horse. Down here, potentially fish. Oh, and there's a lobster there on the plate at the end. Watching the king eat was wildly popular. So popular that a rail around the table and benches had to be erected to manage the crowds. You can imagine dozens of people crammed into the room, hoping for that guaranteed view of the monarch, or even a rarefied invitation to join him in his dining. The room itself is decorated with paintings from the 17th and 18th century that center around hunting, dining, and entertaining. This piece, by Rubens, who painted the people, and Snyders, who painted the food, is titled Pythagoras Advocating Vegetarianism. And on this side, a painting that I'm not personally wild about. This is the work of Franz Snyders, and it depicts a boar hunt. The idea behind a painting like this was for the artist to show off their skills. You can see no two dogs are in the same position, so he's showing us that he can paint these creatures in any conceivable way. Here, another marble fireplace, this one with a beautifully carved chimney piece by Grinling Gibbons depicting the royal coat of arms. Very elaborate, I do like that. And another napkin over here, a goose, I think, maybe a duck. What do you think? And these are figures that represent members of court, made out of crisp white linen. These particular three represent the king, George I, and his two so-called mistresses, excellently nicknamed the elephant and the maypole, in reference to their varying body shapes. This is the king here, and next to him is the maypole, his powerful mistress. Let's see if I can say this. Melusina von der Schulenburg, Duchess of Kendal. She was powerful at court, provided George with 3 children, and some believe was secretly married to the king. George had brought her with him on his move to England, as he did with Sophia von Kelsmanzek, Countess of Darlington, or the elephant, who's depicted over here. She was actually the king's illegitimate half-sister, but for decades was believed to have been his mistress. Next, we enter the Queen's privy chamber. This room was used by Prince George and Princess Caroline to hold formal audiences when they were representing the absent king. Above the marble fireplace is a portrait of Queen Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I, who inherited the throne upon the death of the childless Queen Elizabeth I. The placement of this portrait is deliberate, to remind visitors of the shared blood of the Stuarts and the Hanovarians. Another tapestry here depicting Christ, and then a beautiful rock crystal chandelier. And here the canopy under which the prince and princess would sit. The couple had matching throne chairs, made in 1715, but only one has survived. The chair on the left was created by furniture designer Gareth Neal to represent the missing throne. The room is crowded today, but in the 18th century it would have been jam-packed with courtiers in their most expensive outfits, glittering under the light of that chandelier. The next room we visit is the Queen's drawing room. This was the grandest room in these apartments and was used strictly for entertaining and impressing, both while George and Caroline were Prince and Princess of Wales and also when they were King and Queen. A weekly occasion, known as the drawing room, took place here, where lucky courtiers would meet with the king or with the prince and princess. On Sundays, the drawing room was formal, and courtiers would stand in the center of the room in a circle, and if lucky, may be spoken to by the king or the royal couple. This is one of the rooms that Queen Anne oversaw during her short reign. The wall paintings reference Anne and her husband, Prince George, as if there weren't enough Georges on the tour already, and they also emphasize the rise of Britain's naval power. The ceiling is designed to make the room appear larger than it already is. The painting is a beautiful tribute to the tragic Queen Anne by Antonio Verrio. You can spot her there very easily, right in the center. I say tragic as poor Anne had 17 pregnancies, only 5 of which resulted in a live birth, but none of her children lived past the age of 11, paving the way for the Hanovarian dynasty. Yet another marble fireplace. You'll be tired of them by the end. And more courtiers over here. Now, if we pause, look behind the central figure, you can just make out a hidden door built into the wall. This would have led to a private dining room. Over here, a beautiful replica of a 17th century harpsichord. Caroline loved music and routinely had musicians invited to the palace, not just to play for her guests, but also to give lessons to the royal children. In addition to the drawing room events, occasionally Caroline would call for card tables to be brought out, and guests would enjoy various games, oftentimes gambling huge sums of money. 2 of the most popular were Hazard, a dice-throwing game that had been popular at court since the 14th century. It's even mentioned in the Canterbury Tales. And Brag, an 18th century card game based on a 16th century ancestor of poker. Now we enter the Queen's Gallery. The tapestries on the wall depict the history of Alexander the Great, an allusion to King George II, the last British king to fight in battle. The room is kept dim to preserve the tapestries. Up until now, all the rooms we've walked through were accessible to the public, but this room was private. This is where the royal family could spend time together, and they even exercised here in the winter. On the other side of the gallery, there's some conservation work taking place on Queen Caroline's bed. The Queen's bed had 6 mattresses, filled with horsehair, sheep's wool, or feathers. 4 of the mattresses were silk-lined, and the whole bed was draped in beautiful red brocade. The bed needed to be extravagant and luxurious, because the most privileged and high-status courtiers would be granted access to the monarch's bedchamber, and would be received by the king or queen while they were in bed. Some visitors would witness the Queen having breakfast and being dressed, or they'd watch the king shaving, or even using the toilet. This show would occur again in reverse at the end of the day, and then occasionally the king or queen would slip through a hidden door into another smaller bedchamber, where they actually spent the night. Adjacent to these mattresses is this beautiful chimney piece installed by King William III in tribute to his late wife Mary. The blue and white tulip vases and ewers were hers. And above the fireplace you can see, well, me, but then, far more beautiful, Mary herself, carved by the Flemish sculptor John Nost. And there are two more of those white courtly figures over here, representing George and Caroline, the Prince and Princess of Wales who, in 1727, became King and Queen. They continued to utilize Hampton Court, spending their summers entertaining here, but they would be the last royal couple to do so. The fractious relationship they had with King George I seemed almost hereditary, with the following 3 generations of sons all having terrible relationships with their parents. First was George and Caroline's son, Frederick, who you can see here, and then Frederick's son, King George III, who you can see here, and then, of course, his son, King George IV, seen here. The relationships between father and son got so bad that King George III refused to ever come to Hampton Court once he was king, owing to some poor and shocking experiences he had here as a boy with his grandfather, King George II. But that is a story for another day. As we leave the state apartments, we come down into Hampton Court, which we glimpsed through a window earlier. Although the overall design was inspired by Versailles, Christopher Wren did give it some British flair, with slightly pinkened brick and pale Portland stone. Architectural historian Sir John Summerson says the courtyard looks, quote, startling, as of simultaneous exposure to a great many eyes with raised eyebrows. I'm not sure about that, but what do you think? Look at a view over here. These rooms were apartments for the king and queen, some that we've just been exploring, and the top floor were lodgings for leading servants and courtiers. Now, we've explored a fair bit of the palace interior, which means it's time to make our way outside to the incredible palace gardens. Hampton Court Palace actually has an astonishing 9 gardens, covering 60 acres. And since this video can't be 10 hours long, I'm going to show you 2 of them. And the first that we're going to visit is the grandest, the Great Fountain Garden. Created for William and Mary in 1689, the Great Fountain Garden rests along the decorative east front of the palace, in part of what was previously Henry VIII's hunting grounds. The couple's French gardener, Daniel Moreau, placed the gardens around 3 long, wide avenues in what's known as a crow's foot or a goose foot pattern, which was very fashionable in the 17th century. In this contemporary sketch, you can see Daniel's original garden plan. We're walking down the central path now. Originally, the garden featured beds of flowers, box hedging, holly globes, colored gravel, and 13 water fountains. But the fountains never worked particularly well, and all, aside from this one, were removed after Queen Anne came to Hampton Court. She disliked the expense of the upkeep of the garden, as well as the scent of the box hedging, which she had replaced with the clipped yew trees that still stand here today. Oh, some friends here. Hello. By the 1760s, the palace had ceased being used as a home for the royal family, and instead had become a grace and favor home. This term refers to property that is owned by the crown, or in some cases the prime minister, no comment, which is leased, often rent-free, to a person as part of their job specification or in gratitude for services rendered. As we look back here, we'll see Christopher Wren's beautiful east front. Very picturesque. The grace and favor rooms at Hampton Court were allocated by the Lord Chamberlain as a reward for past services. There are currently no more grace and favor tenants at the palace, although there were still 3 here as late as the year 2005. Just a small piece of trivia related to that. The scientist Michael Faraday lived here as a grace and favor resident from 1862 until his death in 1867. This is him aged around 70, about the time he came to Hampton Court. But back to the 1760s. With royalty no longer living here, King George III's gardener, Lancelot Capability Brown, stopped clipping the topiary, both because it saved money and also because formal gardens had gone out of fashion. The yew trees here would grow wild for years. This bronze statue depicts the 3 graces and is based on the funerary of the monument of the heart of King Henry II of France. Quite a nice view there. It wasn't until after the First World War that gardeners resumed clipping the trees into the toadstool shapes they maintain today. The team of gardeners that work here continue to clip these trees every summer. And now we come to the Long Water. The Long Water predates William and Mary and was created at the order of King Charles II in 1660. Charles had intended it as a wedding gift for his new bride, Catherine of Braganza. Charles carried out much refurbishment in preparation for his wife-to-be's arrival at court, and while the beautiful Long Water, lined with a double row of 2,000 lime trees, and at that time sporting a Venetian gondola, was lovely, the fact that the king's mistress was also at Hampton Court and about to give birth to his child during Charles and Catherine's honeymoon probably took the shine off things a little bit. Now we're walking along the far reaches of the Great Fountain Garden, right on the edge of what's called Home Park, 750 acres of ancient parkland. I mentioned to you earlier that this space used to be the hunting grounds for Henry VIII. He had the parkland in this area entirely closed off to the public so he could hunt his deer in private. But Henry wasn't the only king who hunted or rode horses here. King William III took advantage of Home Park too, but with ultimately fatal results. On the 21st of February 1702, William's horse, Sorrel, is famously believed to have stumbled upon a molehill, throwing the king from his seat. William fell badly and suffered a broken collarbone, which seemed to spell the beginning of the end. He would die around 2 weeks later. Get a beautiful view toward the palace here. The last bit of that goosefoot design. Queen Anne suffered ill health throughout her adult life, but she still loved to hunt. She had a special single-horse carriage created from which she could hunt while being wheeled through the parkland. And note that there are still deer in the park today, thankfully protected rather than hunted. In fact, there's around 300 of them, all descended from Henry VIII's original herd. As we circle back toward the palace, we've got a great view of those toadstool-shaped yew trees, and a herd of geese as well. You can see it started to rain a little bit. And then here, an interesting red brick building. This is a 400-year-old royal tennis court, formerly belonging to Henry VIII. Yes, really. To be fair, it was originally built for Cardinal Wolsey between 1526 and 1529, but I'm not sure how many games he managed to squeeze in before Henry snatched it off him. I know most people have an image of Henry VIII as an older, hugely overweight, grumpy tyrant, but when he was a young king, that was not always the case. Graceful, athletic, and handsome, I know, but by 16th century standards anyway, young Henry was a keen sportsman and talented tennis player. In 1519, a Venetian ambassador wrote home that, quote, "It was the prettiest thing in the world to see him play, his fair skin glowing through a shirt of the finest texture." Tennis was an incredibly popular sport at Henry's court. In fact, Anne Boleyn was betting on a game of tennis when she was arrested to be taken to the Tower of London. Reportedly, she even complained she hadn't had a chance to collect her winnings. This tennis court was heavily refurbished in the 17th century, so most of the brickwork dates from then. It was first overhauled during the reign of King Charles I in 1625, and later by his son Charles II in 1660. Today, the court is home to a real tennis club, which currently has over 450 members. We're approaching the east front of the palace again, and I have a nice photo to share with you that shows 18th century visitors in the same location as us. This drawing dates from 1744 and is by Anthony Highmore. You can see they're just outside the east front, as are we. Queen Anne had statues and ornamental urns placed in the gardens, and there's one here. You can see the faces at the bottom. There's so much detail. Lovely. And a nice overview of Wren's design here. The rooms we're facing are the apartments we saw earlier, laid out for Queen Mary, used by Anne, and later Princess, then Queen, Caroline. And now we visit the Privy Garden. This area of the palace grounds have always been a private space for the monarch. Each sovereign that has resided here has changed it for their own personal use, as usually their rooms would have overlooked this section of the garden. For example, in the time of King Charles I, it was a simple place to display his collection of statues. We can see here where the king's rooms would have been. The version of the Privy Garden that we're walking through today is a faithful recreation of the garden during the time of King William III. Unusually, we have a very detailed record of what this garden looked like, specifically in the year 1702, because that is the year that William died. The king had died before his Privy Garden was completed, and all the gardeners and craftsmen that had worked on it were nervous that perhaps they would not be fully paid. So they submitted a hugely detailed, faithfully reported account of all the work that was carried out here. That means when this garden was replanted in 1995 and officially opened by Charles, Prince of Wales, it was an exact replica of that of King William III. As we look around, we see more yew trees, as well as holly trees and box hedging, inside which are planted flowering spring bulbs. I promise, it's just October in this video. During the period of time that Hampton Court was being used as a grace and favor residence, this garden had been allowed to grow freely. The overgrown trees here blocked the view to the river, but gave the residents some privacy, as by the 1800s, Hampton Court had been open to the public as a tourist attraction. Officially opened by Queen Victoria in 1838, Hampton Court became a popular destination, its gardens in particular being a draw, and by 1881 had welcomed over 10 million visitors. Now, as we turn here, you'll see a decorative iron screen, designed again by Jean Tigeot, separating the garden from the River Thames. The screen is decorated with the monogram of William and Mary, as well as emblems representing England, Scotland, and France. I'll get a close-up for you here. Right in the center. So you can't see the river, but it's just the other side of that beautiful gate. In the time of Henry VIII, this garden would have looked completely different, and although we don't have as accurate an account of Henry's garden as we do of William's, we have a very small clue into what royal gardens in the time of Henry VIII would have looked like, and it's hidden in a portrait we've already seen today. family portrait hanging in the haunted gallery. If we look to the far left and right, behind the two fools, we glimpse Henry's garden. It appears as though his garden was laid out in a design featuring various squares, bordered with small white and green railings. Most interesting of all, the gardens feature green and white poles, atop which heraldic beasts with flowing flags are perched. The Privy Garden in Henry's time opened up onto the River Thames, and he would have docked his royal barge there, ready for his return into central London. And now we return to the palace, but I do have something else to share with you on top of those stairs up ahead. This sundial. This is a facsimile of the original, which was part of a pair, commissioned by William III for this Privy Garden. They were created by Thomas Tompion, whose name you can see engraved on top. This sundial was so perfectly executed and accurate, no matter the season, that this is what was used to set the time of the clocks inside the palace. And our last view of the Privy Garden before we head back into the great fountain garden and make a left. It's almost time to leave the palace, so we're going to retrace our steps and re-enter the building. But we do have one more place to explore before we say goodbye. To leave the palace, we're going to exit through Clock Court, highlighting the contrast between the 17th century building there on the left and the original Tudor. The building ahead previously held Anne Boleyn's apartments, and to the right, the outside of the Great Hall that we visited much earlier. It's beautiful even from the outside, isn't it? That big window we saw. Now this courtyard is named Clock Court because of the beautiful 500-year-old astronomical clock you can see here. Installed for Henry VIII in 1540, note that the sun moves around the earth, the clock features 3 separate copper dials, all revolving at different speeds to display the current hour, month, sign of the zodiac, number of days since the beginning of the year, and the phases of the moon, the last of which held particular importance, as this would indicate high and low tides, essential information when most people traveled to and from Hampton Court by barge. The clock as we see it today has been restored throughout the centuries, with as many of the original pieces maintained as possible. And now we walk back through Anne Boleyn's gatehouse and return to Base Court. You'll remember the wine fountain from earlier up ahead on our left. Look for me there on your next visit to the palace. As we pan around, you can again see that beautiful diamond pattern on the brick. It's very clear here. Looking lovely. And back around toward the kitchens, you'll see the door that we exited out of about an hour ago, there in the corner. And dressed in red here, we see a Tudor guardsman. History stays alive at Hampton Court. If you've enjoyed this tour of Hampton Court Palace, please let me know in the comments. I love reading people's messages. Well, the nice ones anyway. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Free Tours by Foot London channel. And if there's a castle or a palace you'd like to see, or another topic you think I should cover, just let me know. Thank you for coming along with me today. Again, my name is Margaret, and it's been lovely traveling through time with you. And now we return to the 21st century.